I want to provide a bit of a review of the first 3 weeks of this course, largely because we're halfway through. This is the midterm point of the term. It's an express term, so we go through pretty quickly. So I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. And then secondly, because next week I'm going to ask you to apply what you've learned in these 3 weeks to a case study, to a fact pattern, and I'm hoping you're able to really concretely and explicitly take some of the lessons that I'm going to go through here, and then you're going to apply the readings by either referring back to your notes. For those of you who used annotating software, you can use those, or you go back to the readings themselves and make sure that you cite them, right? Use reference to them or use examples from those readings. That also goes for the videos and the websites. So the very first thing I wanted you to really try to understand, big picture, is this concept of systemic bias. And to get you to not see this as an individual choice, but to see that biases are built into systems. So if you go from one system to another, you're going to behave differently because the bias is going to be pushing you to act one way, or you're going to have to resist those biases. And so I asked you to look at a video about housing inequality in New York City. And that should have showed you how segregation and racial discrimination operate through gentrification. And this is the economic system of real estate speculation that we live in New York City. So this is a very particular economic system that really you can see clearly in an urban area like the city. To some extent, it works in rural areas or more country or farm areas. But it works a little bit differently because the speculation there is based on industry and farming, whereas here it's based on the actual buying and selling of real estate through essentially, right, most of us apartments, but in some extent you also see houses and buildings if you talk about larger incomes. You'll also have learned how this is a product, this is a result of systemic racism because of racial capitalism that still exists today, but it was obviously very plainly endorsed in the 1700s as racial slavery was at its peak of buying and selling humans and speculating on their worth and selling them like stocks or digital currency. And so this is a result, right? This is the result of our system now is the result of that decision way back long ago that we've never really escaped. We've never changed that structure. To some extent, chattel slavery was somewhat ended, not completely ended. You can find lots of examples today. But it was certainly frowned upon, and there was an element of law that you could now use to enforce that right that didn't exist. And so now you want to think about how this all kind of plays itself out through the mobilization of bias, which means that some actions are going to be favored, they're going to be preferred, while others are going to be looked down on, and that the goal of this system is to promote individual rights that push forward the profit value of property. And here's there's going to be, this is a piece of art by Dred Scott who shows that there's impossibility of the concept of freedom in practice, right? The reality of freedom in a system that's based in slavery, right? So you'd have to have a different system in order to have a full concept of freedom. And so here's where you see the systemic bias working itself out against one particular actor, right? You want to multiply that out by other people, but in this case, you can see it very clearly. It's as if there's a bunch of water being thrown at this individual, and that's what they have to go up against in the pursuit of freedom. The next thing I want you to see is that there's also ideological bias, meaning the beliefs that the system puts forward, that the myths that we believe in, the things that we think are real, and the way that we kind of make decisions. So one of the largest biases you see in criminal justice is this very erroneous theory, but very popular theory of broken windows policing. This reinforces the idea that crimes are committed by a personal choice. And so probably, when you saw it, it was the two white men in both California and New York that were doing the bad behavior because society was disorganized. what I really want you to get from that is to understand that, think about that ideology, right? That disorganization means that white people can behave in a disorganized way, and that's not criminal. People who are not white, however, still operate and live in that same disorganized society, but they don't have that same freedom to suddenly commit crimes and get away with it. And so this is a very biased point of view, a very biased way of looking at policing that favors the middle and upper classes who tend to be white in this country. It's not exclusively the case, but by and large, if you look at the statistics. And so it's a very, if you could say, it's a white middle class way of looking at policing. It's also completely unrealistic. It's not real. The idea that somehow if you see a broken window, there's going to be a bunch of crime. In science, we'd call this a correlation, not causation, right? So the broken window is not what led to crime. Is it a symptom of crime? That's what the writers are really trying to get you to think about, but it's really a justification for aggressive policing, leading to things like stop and frisk. So you kind of see this argument that rights really shouldn't exist unless the person can demonstrate they earn them, they deserve them. And anyone who lives in a disorganized or poverty area or a quote-unquote high crime area, they don't deserve their rights. This is the argument. And so you see who this bias is and who it favors and who it works against. The second idea is that, this also just taking a larger picture, and that's what I'm trying to get you to see here. I'm pulling this picture back. So that broken window is on Central Park West, and you can see it's in a very expensive multi-million-dollar building. Crime did not go up in this neighborhood when the window was broken. And so you see again that it's not universal. It's even kind of a misleading idea. If I go into an area that I'm already saying is high crime and then I look for broken windows, the same theory should apply in wealthier neighborhoods, but it doesn't. So it's not a very good theory. And yet people continue to believe in this myth that disorganized society is going to lead to more crimes. Again, this isn't a cause. This can be a correlation. But you see the same kind of logic working itself out in the Callahan versus Casey case, where basically, people think, they say, oh, we have a right to housing. There is no right to housing, and that's not what the court said. The court said there's a right to shelter, but only to those that government agencies deem they need it. And so there can be lots of people we see out on the streets who we think need shelter, but the government, for a variety of reasons, has determined that they aren't in need. In other words, they don't qualify. So again, you see this kind of ideology of you must deserve the right in order to get it. And again, that's the second level, it's not housing, it's shelter. Right? So you have, quote unquote, the right, if the government decides you're needy, to have a shelter. But this isn't to property or to housing or to privacy, right? This is just to warehousing you or placing you into a large facility, which is, you could similar arguments can be made that prison is a shelter, right? And that might sound like an exaggeration, but there are many political people who believe that is true, and that's how it should be done. And so, you could see this in Boise, Idaho, and other places where they've kind of tried to take this approach. So the point again is, I don't want you to get confused by thinking there's a right to housing when that's not at all what the court has said. And so you want to say again, this is all about people who, quote unquote, deserve it. And so a bunch of people who you and I might think, quote unquote, deserve their rights, the government does not believe that. And again, that's because of this ideological bias. And again, that's all for profit and for property. And so if you don't have property and you're not making a profit, then you're not automatically assumed to be deserving of rights. So by the third week, then you're going to see multiple examples in the readings of not how the system works against people and people of color in particular, and also women, children, immigrants, and undocumented. And what you see here over and over again is that what the system of bias does is it establishes cultural supremacy, or the idea that one people is superior to other people, or that they're less deserving of power, of rights, of living, essentially, a full life. And again, this is not about individuals making decisions. They're not making choices to be prejudiced, right? That obviously happens. It's more about the system is promoting that idea. The system is saying, essentially reminding you all over the place that middle class and upper class white people are superior, and this is for these reasons, right? These aren't scientific reasons. They're not even logical reasons. It's just maintaining the system through the mobilization of bias and a lot of segregation, right? Keeping people separate is a good way of making people think that they're better off than other people. And so again, you got to see that this is really the idea that wealthy white men have used violence, economy, and law to pursue their own best interest, which oftentimes is not at the interest, in fact, most of the time is not the interest of other people, but just reinforces their own power. But this isn't the end of the story. You'll also see in those examples resistance, right? So people aren't just, objects that get moved around on a pool table, right? They fight back. And what's striking to socio-legal scholars like myself is people don't automatically resort to violence or war. They don't start organizing and then overthrow the government. Instead, they use the concepts of rights and law to argue that they should have equality. And so this is really what you want to start to see is how do they do this? They use this through education, self-definition, technical skills like you see from Manon using mapping as a way of fighting back and showing where evictions are happening, who the worst landlords are, what rules are being violated, and kind of using the power of domination against those people. So I really want you to think about this because it's such an interesting under-examined or under-thought about concept that people actually use rights as consciousness, as group understanding to say, hey, this isn't fair, this isn't right, I'm going to push back because you're being, contradictory or you're being inconsistent or hypocritical. So you want to think about how people talk using this language. And then finally, I'm going to ask you to apply your learning, right? So this can be challenging because I think there's two examples I pull out is, on the one hand, you were largely educated to think that a right is a claim or title that you're due. And that it's fundamental and it can't be taken away from you. And then they gave you this ridiculous idea, but it's not like a privilege. This is all nonsense, right? It's a very nice story. It's like when a parent tells their child, who's afraid of the dark, that there's no monsters in the closet. This thing, this nightlight's going to protect you, or this teddy bear, or another invisible being will come and protect you, right? I'm sure this is good. This is good parenting. You don't want to tell your children that, there's nothing I can do to keep you safe. You're going to die. So, I understand the need to want to have this paternal idea that if anything bad happens to you, you've got a constitutional right and it's going to protect you. It's just nonsense. It's childish. So again, I understand why teachers did this in K through 12. I wish they wouldn't. But, I understand why they did. So we have to get out of that thinking and say the world is not black and white like that. The other side of this is that we're surrounded by people who are blaming individuals, and we live in this cult of the individual where everyone thinks that the individual has way more power than they actually have. And so, this is what you see on social media. It doesn't matter who the president is, right? They always think the president is the person who can make all the rules. And this is all nonsense, right? It's true in movies. It's true in celebrity, gossip, right? What you see on TV is, of course, not how people actually live, and they have their own problems. So you want to start to think about what can people do, right? What powers do they have? But also, how are they restrained? How are they constrained? And then how do they resist? And that's what I want you to be thinking about at the systemic level. So what are these forms of discrimination and how do they operate for regular people, especially when it comes to the right to housing or the right to shelter, and how they're really treated, and what would keep them from being able to exercising their rights. So not thinking about it in the perfect world or the ideal, right? We're not thinking like children. We're not just blaming individuals, right? We're trying to think of the whole system, right? This is the whole kind of point of this class and of criminal justice in particular, is that you're looking at the system, not individuals. So I hope that's helpful, and you want to try to apply this learning next week when you get that case study.